In the shadowed hollows of Tennessee, on the brutal frontier of 1813, a secret took root. It was not buried in the earth, nor carved on stone, but carried in the silences of a small, isolated community that knew better than to speak too loudly of what it had seen. They called them the Harrow Sisters. 4 girls who, in a time when life was brief and cruel, and every face carried the lines of hunger and grief, simply refused to change. Their skin did not weather under the sun. Their hair did not grey. The years did not leave their marks, not in the way they left them on everyone else. While neighbours dug shallow graves for children and buried wives before their 35th year, these 4 walked the same paths unchanged, generation after generation. And the people of the Hollow, who feared God more than they feared death, feared the sisters most of all. This is a story you were never meant to hear. A chapter of American history half erased, spoken of only in whispers by families who claim to have seen the same faces watching from the tree line long after their grandparents had gone to dust. It is a story that unsettles because it challenges the one truth we cling to, that time is the great equalizer, the silent law that binds us all. But in the valley of Larkspur Hollow, time bent, or perhaps it broke, and the result was 4 young women with eyes as still as a pond at midnight and faces as pale and flawless as porcelain. They were not a blessing. They were not a miracle. They were a curse, a prison in human shape, binding an entire valley in silence, suspicion, and fear. Before we go further into the dark woods of this story, please subscribe and stay with us. The Macabre record is a place where forgotten histories and buried truths are exhumed. What you are about to hear is not a tale for comfort. It is meant to unsettle, to remind you that sometimes the darkest pact. Turns of control are not invented in the present, they are inherited from the past. So join us, and do not turn away, for the further we go, the harder it will be to leave. This story does not begin with their birth, for no one could ever say when that was, but with the arrival of a man who dared to ask the one question forbidden in the Hollow: why? His name was Josiah Vance, a surveyor for the government, a man trained to pin down borders and measure the world into neat lines. But the Harrow Sisters were not a line he could measure. They were an impossibility, and they were waiting. Josiah Vance arrived in Larkspur Hollow with his surveying tools and a mind disciplined by maps, angles, and lines. To him, the world was a puzzle of geometry waiting to be solved, a wilderness to be tamed by measurement and ink. He believed in progress, in the promise that no matter how wild the land appeared, it could be reduced to numbers and boundaries. But as he descended the winding track into the valley, he felt something he had no number for, a tension, coiled and unspoken, that hung over the community like a mist. The Hollow was prosperous in a way that unsettled him. Crops grew tall even in lean seasons, livestock swelled fat, while other farms across Tennessee suffered blight, and every child he saw ran strong-limbed and clear-eyed. There was no trace of the sickness, deformity, or want that scarred so many frontier families. It was, on the surface, a paradise. Yet Josiah knew enough of men to recognize when blessings came with a price. The people of the Hollow welcomed him with politeness, but their words were vague, their eyes cautious. They answered his questions about fence lines and property boundaries readily enough, but the moment his inquiries drifted northward toward the ridge where the Harrow homestead stood, the conversations dissolved into silence. Heads turned away, hands fidgeted, smiles faltered. The Hollow was united not in faith or trade, but in avoidance. It was as if the very name of the ridge carried weight too heavy for them to speak aloud. And in that silence, Josiah's curiosity sharpened to obsession. He wrote in his notebook on the first evening, while the lamps of the valley flickered against the encroaching dark. There is an arrangement here, though unspoken. The prosperity of this place is unnatural, and yet they wear it like a cloak, refusing to explain its source. The land itself seems to pulse with order, as if some secret rhythm governs it. I ask myself if I am not measuring a valley at all, but a design, deliberate ancient and hidden from view. The Hollow slept quietly that night, but Josiah did not. From the thin window of his rented room, he saw a figure, or perhaps four, standing far off at the tree line where the ridge began. They did not move, and they did not waver, though he swore he blinked a dozen times. They seemed to watch the town, not as strangers, but as wardens. He closed his notebook with trembling hands. This was no ordinary posting. The map he was sent to draw would not hold the truth of this place. Josiah's first true encounter with the sisters came a week into his stay, when he ventured into the market square at the valley's centre. The air was thick with the smell of leather, fresh-cut timber, and the tang of smoke from the blacksmith's forge. Farmers gathered with baskets of grain and root vegetables. Women exchanged cloth and soap, and children darted between the stalls in bursts of laughter. On the surface, it was a scene of ordinary life, but Josiah soon noticed the way conversations dimmed, the way hands stilled and eyes turned, all in the same direction. He followed their gazes, and there they were, the Harrow Sisters. They moved as one, a line of four figures drifting through the crowd with a grace that seemed almost rehearsed. Each was beautiful in a way that unsettled rather than comforted. One bore hair pale as wheat, and eyes the colour of slate. Another's hair was black as coal, her gaze sharp and cold. The third had eyes so pale they seemed almost translucent, while the fourth's green stare carried the freshness of spring leaves. Their faces were youthful, flawless, unmarred by the hard life of the frontier. No scars, no calluses, no fatigue carved into their skin. In a land where survival wrote itself on the body, theirs told no story at all. They spoke rarely, voices low and melodic, as if carrying the cadence of an older language. They bartered for supplies, grain, fabric, candles, with exactness, never more, never less, and never a smile on their lips. The townsfolk dealt with them quickly, heads lowered, hands trembling slightly as coins and goods exchanged. It was not reverence Josiah saw in the people's eyes. It was fear, sharpened by years of silent endurance. Josiah wrote later that night, "They move as though the crowd is a river, and they are its current, pulling all with them, but untouched by it themselves. They are young, yet the stairs that follow them are the stairs of memory. These people have seen them before, not once, but for decades, and they have never changed." He watched them longer than was wise, fascinated, until he realized the youngest seeming of the sisters, the one with glass-pale eyes, had turned her head. Her gaze met his across the market, and in that instant the hum of voices seemed to die away. She did not smile. She did not frown. She only looked, as though measuring him against some hidden ledger, and then, just as quickly, she turned back, and the sisters walked on, leaving Josiah with a chill that no fire could warm. The sight of the sisters haunted Josiah long after that market day. Their faces lingered in his mind each night, more vivid than the ink on his maps. He resolved to question the townsfolk, to force the truth into daylight. Yet every attempt ended in silence, denial, or fear. He asked a shopkeeper, a woman of middle years with strong arms from years of labour, how long the Harrows had lived on the ridge. Her lips tightened, her eyes dropped to her hands, and she muttered only that their family had always been there. When pressed, she claimed she had chores and turned away, leaving him speaking to empty air. The schoolteacher, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, was no better. Josiah asked him how many years he had taught the valley's children. 23, the teacher said proudly. But when Josiah asked if the Harrow sisters had ever been among his pupils, the man's face drained of colour. He gathered his papers, hands trembling, and left without answering. At last Josiah turned to the blacksmith, a man whose face was a road map of hardship, every crease carved by smoke, toil, and loss. Inside his workshop, the air rang with hammer blows, sparks leaping with each strike. Josiah asked casually how old the sisters were, as though the question meant little. But the hammer slipped from the man's hand, crashing against the floor with a clang so sharp it seemed to split the silence. For a long moment, the blacksmith did not speak. Then, without lifting his eyes, he muttered, "They were here when my father was a boy, and they looked the same then." Josiah did the arithmetic in his head. If true, the sisters would be at least 60, perhaps 70 years old. Yet what he had seen in the market were faces untouched by time, not a wrinkle, not a shadow of decay. He pressed the blacksmith further, but the man turned away, his back like a wall. "Some things are not meant to be measured, surveyor," he said. "You map the land. You leave the souls on it alone." That night, Josiah wrote in his journal, "It is not piety that silences them. It is terror. The entire valley acts as jailer for a secret they dare not speak. They are not protecting the sisters. They are containing them." His hand trembled as he wrote, but his obsession only deepened. Josiah's resolve hardened into something dangerous. The warnings of the townsfolk, the blacksmith's cryptic refusal, even the chill of the sisters' gaze at the market, all of it only deepened his hunger for answers. He knew he could not pry the truth from the community. Their fear was too complete, their silence too practiced. If the people of Larkspur Hollow would not speak, then he would have to see for himself. And so he turned to a lie. Josiah had dabbled in botany during his long expeditions, sketching plants and cataloguing their peculiarities. It was not his profession, but it was a skill convincing enough to pass as a cover. He spread word quietly that he was studying the valley's unusual flora. It was not entirely untrue, for he had already noticed the plants here carried a strangeness to them, blossoms that grew in unnatural colors, ferns with leaves more intricate than any he had ever seen, moss that clung to shaded stones in patterns resembling runes. The land itself seemed altered, and it offered him the perfect excuse to approach the ridge where the Harrow homestead stood. With his satchel filled with paper, charcoal and instruments, he set out on a morning heavy with fog. The path wound upward, deeper into woods that grew darker and older with every step. The trees here leaned in on themselves, their branches knitted like ribs above his head. The air grew cooler, unnaturally so, and even the bird-song faded, until the only sound was the crunch of his boots on the damp earth. When he reached the clearing, he stopped in wonder and dread. The Harrow house stood before him, a sprawling log structure of a style that belonged to a century past. Its timbers were solid, unweathered, untouched by rot or moss. No sagging roofline, no chipped paint, no weeds choking its foundation. It was as if the house, like its occupants, had been removed from the grasp of time. His windows reflected the pale sky, blank and watchful. The air hummed faintly, a static charge that prickled the hair along Josiah's arms. He had come under the guise of study, but standing at the edge of the homestead, he knew his ruse was thin. The house itself seemed to know him already, to weigh his intentions, to wait. And then the door creaked open, slowly, as though it had been expecting him. The door opened with the quiet patience of something that had been waiting for centuries. A figure appeared on the threshold, and Josiah's breath caught in his chest. It was one of the sisters, tall, with hair the color of embers and eyes green as deep moss. Her skin was flawless, untouched by weather or labor, and yet her presence carried the weight of something ancient, like stone smoothed by endless river water. She did not greet him, nor did she ask his purpose. She simply said, in a voice that was both honey and frost, "You are the surveyor." It was not a question. Josiah steadied himself, explaining that he was studying the valley's plant life, that he had heard the land around their homestead was more pristine than any other in the hollow. He requested permission to sketch, to take notes, to gather only what could be documented by hand. His voice wavered against the heavy stillness between them. The sister studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing, and he felt with a shiver, as though his thoughts were being examined, turned over like pages in a book he had not consented to share. At last she spoke again. "My sisters and I are fond of nature's rarities," she said, though her lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "You may look, but you will not stray from the woods, and you will not touch anything that grows near the spring." Her gaze flicked toward a cluster of ancient trees that rose in the distance, their trunks twisted, their crowns shrouded in faint mist that seemed to cling unnaturally to the air. The warning did not sound like a courtesy, nor even a rule. It sounded like a law of physics, immutable and absolute. He nodded, bowing his head with false humility, though his pulse hammered with fear. The sister stepped aside, allowing him to pass into the clearing. As he crossed the threshold of their land, he felt it. A sudden static hum, subtle but unmistakable, vibrating in the air, crawling across his skin like invisible threads. The house loomed behind him as he moved deeper into the woods, his satchel heavy on his shoulder. He forced himself to breathe, to act the part of a botanist absorbed in his work. But in his heart he knew the truth. He had not been granted permission. He had been allowed entry into a trap. Josiah remained on the Harrow property for several days, though every hour felt as though he balanced on the edge of discovery. By day he sketched plants, crouching low in the damp soil to copy the fine lines of ferns whose fronds curled in impossible spirals, or the blossoms of pale flowers that opened and closed not by sunlight, but as if by some secret rhythm of their own. There was moss that glowed faintly in the shade, a greenish luminescence that dimmed when touched. He recorded it all, his hand moving feverishly. Though he knew his notes were not merely botanical, they were fragments of a greater mystery, hints of a system beyond comprehension. Yet no discovery unnerved him more than the sisters themselves. Hay appeared without warning, slipping from the house into the woods with a grace that seemed rehearsed, though no voice passed between them. He watched as they tended to their geometrically ordered gardens, their movements so precise, so synchronous, that it seemed less like four individuals working together than one entity expressed in four bodies. They would scatter to gather herbs and return in the same moment, as though guided by a signal Josiah could not perceive. He noted in his journal, "They do not speak to one another, yet they never falter in their unity. They move in concert, in silence, as if words are unnecessary, as if thought itself is shared among them." The observation chilled him more than he wished to admit. It was not merely their agelessness that disturbed him. It was their perfection. Their silence suggested not only discipline, but something inhuman, something that stood outside the natural discord of human life. At night, as he lay in his rented room at the valley's edge, Josiah thought he could feel them still. Even when they were nowhere in sight, he sensed their presence, as though the very trees leaned in his direction, bearing witness. He began to believe the sisters did not sleep as others did, that perhaps they did not sleep at all. And through it all, one image persisted: the mist-shrouded grove near the spring, the forbidden place. He had promised with his silence to avoid it, but the weight of the warning made his curiosity unbearable. It was not merely a patch of trees. It was the center of the pattern, the secret he had been pulled into this valley to discover. At last, Josiah's resolve broke beneath the weight of his obsession. One grey morning, when the sisters had vanished into the depths of the homestead, he crept toward the grove they had forbidden him to enter. The mist that curled between the trunks seemed to thicken with each step, rising like breath from the earth itself. The air grew colder, though no wind stirred the branches. His boots sank into soil that felt strangely soft, as though it had been turned again and again, not by plough but by something older, something restless beneath the surface. When he reached the center of the grove, he found it, the spring, a pool of water so dark and still it seemed less a reflection of the sky than an opening into nothingness. Around it lay a perfect circle of barren ground, a space where no grass grew, no weeds dared intrude, 10 feet of emptiness that marked the boundary between the living and whatever force dwelled within that black pool. He knelt, heart hammering, and touched the soil. It was damp, but not with ordinary water. It clung to his fingers like ash, leaving a faint sting in his skin. Then his eyes caught something carved into the flat stone at the spring's edge. A symbol etched deep, its lines interlocked to form a star within a circle, each point reaching inward to touch the center. It was no mark he recognized, neither native to these lands nor belonging to any scripture he knew. It radiated purpose, the geometry of a lock waiting for its key. Josiah traced it lightly with trembling fingers, and in that moment he felt the wahum, 8 of eyes upon him. "You were told not to come here." The voice froze him in place. He turned slowly and saw her, another of the sisters, her hair white as frost, her face youthful as the rest, but her gaze older than mountains. She regarded him with no anger, only a sorrow that chilled him deeper than rage ever could. "This place is not for you," she said softly. "The water remembers things your mind is not shaped to hold." He gestured toward the carved symbol, desperate for meaning. "What is this?" he whispered. Her eyes flicked to it and back to him, and for a moment he thought he saw pity in her expression. "It is a lock," she murmured, "and we are the key. Now leave, surveyor. The ground here is hungry, and it does not know the difference between root and bone." Josiah stumbled back from the spring that night with his mind burning. He could not rid himself of the white-haired sister's words. A lock, and they were the key. What was it they were holding closed? What was it the valley was keeping contained within that pool of black water? His journal pages grew frantic, ink pressed so heavily into the paper that it nearly tore through. He sketched the symbol again and again, its geometry refusing to leave his thoughts. He traced lines and angles, searching for some resemblance to the mathematical diagrams he trusted, but the shape resisted translation. It was older than arithmetic, older than scripture. It was a language of the earth itself. He wrote, "If the sisters are the key, then the hollow itself is a prison. They are not spared by time out of blessing, but because their lives are shackled to the work of keeping something bound. The silence of the townsfolk is not protection of the sisters. It is complicity in their task. They are wardens of a lock too terrible to open." Driven by both terror and the addictive pull of forbidden knowledge, Josiah tried to raise the subject with the people of Larkspur once more. He spoke first to the shopkeeper, mentioning the barren circle and the carved stone. Her face went blank, the warmth of her features evaporating into something hard and unreadable. Without a word, she turned her back and closed her shutters, though the sun was still high. The schoolteacher, when approached, would not even look at him. His hands shook as he gathered his pupils and ushered them inside, barring the door. Through the window, Josiah caught the man's lips moving as though in prayer. But whether he prayed for protection or for silence, he could not tell. When he pressed the blacksmith a second time, mentioning the symbol and the phrase he had heard, "a lock, and they the key," the man's face darkened. He lowered his hammer with deliberate finality, the steel ringing like a warning bell. "Leave it," the blacksmith said, voice low and tight. "You think you bring truth, but all you bring is disruption. The hollow stands because it is balanced. Outsiders cannot disturb that balance. Do not ask again." Josiah left the forge shaken, the threat clear. The people were not protecting him from the sisters. They were protecting the sisters from him. And the more they tried to silence him, the more his mind screamed to uncover what lay behind that lock. Josiah realized the hollow was sealed against him. Every door closed, every voice silenced, every gesture reminding him he was not welcome. Yet one eve, as the sun sank behind the ridge and shadows stretched long across the fields, he heard of a woman who lived beyond the edge of the town, a midwife named Agnes. She was whispered of with equal parts suspicion and respect, a woman who practiced remedies older than the Bible, herbs and charms that most in the hollow used but never admitted to. She lived alone in a sagging cabin where the fields gave way to forest, a place few visited unless necessity drove them. If anyone held the truth of the sisters, Josiah believed it would be her. He approached her cottage at dusk, carrying a bundle of dried herbs he had gathered from his travels, hoping they would be accepted as offering. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, carrying a scent of cedar and something sharper. The door creaked open before he knocked, and there she stood, ancient, her skin lined like bark, her eyes clouded with cataracts yet burning with a sharp intelligence. She looked at him for a long moment, then rasped, "They'll see you." Josiah hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice low, almost pleading. He told her he needed to understand, that he had seen the sisters with his own eyes, that he had stood at the spring and touched the stone. At the mention of the spring, Agnes's face darkened, but she did not turn him away. Instead, she gestured him inside with a trembling hand. The cabin was cluttered with dried herbs hanging from rafters, jars of strange powders on the shelves, the air thick with the mingled scent of smoke and sage. She seated herself by the fire and let the silence stretch until Josiah thought she might send him off after all. At last she said, "Understanding is poison in this valley, surveyor. But if you have seen the stone, the hollow will not let you leave without knowing. So I will tell you something, though you may wish I hadn't." She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They are not what they seem. They are not women as you or I are. They are the hollow's bargain, its keepers, its prison wardens. What the valley gives, they preserve. What the valley takes, they consume. That is why they do not age. That is why they cannot die." Agnes's words struck Josiah like a blow, yet he pressed her for more. His pen trembled above the page as he asked, "What do they take? What is the price?" The old woman's mouth tightened, and for a long while she only stared into the fire, the glow painting her creased face with flickering shadows. Finally she spoke. "They don't take what you can hold. They take what you might have been. Every path not walked, every choice unmade. They feed on futures." Josiah frowned, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Listen. When my sister was young, she was a gifted artist. She planned to leave the Hollow, to study in Philadelphia. A week before her departure, she fell and broke her hand. Not a terrible wound, but it never healed right. Her gift was gone. She stayed here, married a farmer, lived and died with her spirit dimmed. That accident was no accident, surveyor. It was the Hollow pruning its garden. It spares what is needed. It owns the rest." Josiah scribbled feverishly, scarcely able to believe what he heard. "But the prosperity," he muttered. "The children born strong. The harvests that never fail." Agnes's gaze burned. "Do you not see? That is the trade. We live without famine, but ambition dies here. No one leaves. No one rises above their station. The sisters weave a life that is safe, yes, but only because it is stagnant. We are plants in a walled garden, trimmed and kept. Our children do not starve, but neither do they dream." The fire popped sharply, and for a moment Josiah thought he heard something stir outside the cabin, the faint crunch of leaves beneath unseen feet. Agnes leaned closer, her whisper a rasp that seemed to scrape the inside of his ears. "The sisters are not spared from time out of kindness. They are bound by it. They drink the years we cannot live, the possibilities we are denied. That is their food. That is their curse." Josiah shivered, his pen falling from his hand. The logic of it was monstrous, yet it explained what his maps and journals could not. The Hollow's prosperity was not a miracle, but a cage. The sisters were not guardians of the people. They were keepers of the prison, and every man, woman, and child inside was part of the toll. From the night of his meeting with Agnes, Josiah felt the Hollow tighten around him like a noose. Where once the townsfolk had greeted him with forced politeness, now their eyes followed him with open suspicion. Conversations hushed the moment he entered a room. Children who had once darted through the streets with laughter grew silent when he passed, retreating behind doorframes as though warned against even meeting his gaze. The weight of the sisters' presence, once felt only at a distance, now seemed to rest on every shoulder in the valley, and all of it pressed down on him. He returned each evening to his notes, trying to order the chaos of his thoughts. His journal filled with frantic scrawls. The valley acts as a living organism, pruning deviation, consuming ambition, feeding itself back into the people until nothing remains but quiet compliance. The sisters are its keepers, but also its symptom. The more he wrote, the more he realized he was no longer simply an observer. He had become a contaminant, and the Hollow knew it. One morning, while taking measurements along the creek, Josiah noticed two men watching him from the ridge. They did not approach, nor did they hide. They simply stood there, arms folded, eyes never leaving him. Later that day, as he passed the blacksmith's shop, he saw the man sharpen a blade slowly, deliberately, his expression cold. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Josiah's questions were no longer tolerated. His presence had shifted from inconvenient to dangerous. At night, he began to hear noises outside his rented cabin. The crunch of gravel, the creak of a board, then silence. When he flung the door open, nothing but darkness and stillness met him. Once he found a small bundle of twigs arranged in 4 neat lines on his threshold. He crushed them underfoot, though his hands shook as he did. Sleep abandoned him. He lay awake with a pistol by his side, every creak of the floorboards magnified into threat. He began to imagine the sisters not as distant figures in the woods, but as shadows pressing against his walls, their unblinking eyes piercing the thin glass of his window. He felt the valley closing in, and he knew the people were not guarding him from the sisters. They were guarding the sisters from him, and the sisters, patient and silent, were waiting for him to make the next move. Josiah's fear soon twisted into compulsion. If the valley meant to watch him, then he would watch in return. By day he kept his pretense of surveying, marking boundary stones and scratching neat lines into his maps. But by night he crept back toward the ridge, keeping to the thickets and the cover of moonless skies. He told himself he needed proof, something more than whispers and warnings, something that could be carried from this cursed place and shown to the world. Yet beneath that rationalization lay something darker, a hunger to see what the sisters did when they believed no one was watching. The Harrow house loomed in the clearing like a relic immune to decay, its logs pale under the starlight. No lamps burned within, no candlelight glowed against its windows. And yet, at certain hours, Josiah saw a soft illumination pulse from the inside, silvery, breathing, as if the house itself exhaled light. It grew and faded in rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, filling the clearing with a faint shimmer before retreating again into the timbers. He crouched in the underbrush, his breath held as the sisters emerged from the doorway. They moved with the same silent grace he had witnessed in the market, but here their movements were slower, deliberate, ritualistic. They circled the geometrically precise garden, their arms raised, their hands tracing unseen patterns in the night air. Not one word was spoken, yet their unity was absolute, a choreography older than memory. They bent to touch the earth, then lifted their palms toward the stars, as though gathering power from both sky and soil. Josiah noted feverishly in his journal by the dim light of the moon, "This is no farming, no tending of crops. It is a communion, a weaving of energies, as if they stitch the valley together each night so it does not unravel by morning. The people are not free. They are tethered to this work, as surely as the sisters themselves." On the third night, he dared to edge closer, close enough to hear a sound that chilled his blood. It was not chanting. It was not song. It was the faint hum of many voices speaking in unison just beyond the range of words, an endless vibration that seemed to sink into his bones. He stumbled back, clutching his chest, convinced for a moment that his heart had faltered. When he caught his breath, the sisters had vanished. The glow within the house had gone dark, leaving only silence, and Josiah realized that if they had wanted him to be seen, he already would have been. In the days that followed, Josiah began to notice what he had missed before. The subtle transactions, the quiet rhythm of offerings and rewards that bound the hollow to the sisters like a web. A farmer whose cow had fallen ill left a basket of apples at the stump near the ridge, the fruit polished to a sheen. By morning, the apples were gone, and the cow stood in the field, restored to health as though the sickness had been a dream. A woman, heavy with child and racked with pain, carried a small wooden carving to the edge of the Harrow property. 2 nights later, she gave birth swiftly and safely, without complication. Again and again, Josiah witnessed it. The same strange pattern. Gifts left in silence, answered by prosperity. No money changed hands, no agreement spoken aloud, yet the pact was observed with absolute fidelity. The sisters did not beg, nor did they threaten. They simply received, and the valley flourished. To refuse, Josiah suspected, would mean ruin. He scribbled, in his notebook, his hand shaking. This is a system older than law, older than covenant. It is not barter, not commerce. It is tribute. The valley feeds its keepers, so they will keep the valley whole. It is a cycle closed upon itself, perfected through fear. He knew then why the townsfolk would never speak of the sisters. They were not free people. They were dependents, complicit in their own captivity. One evening he followed at a distance as a young boy crept to the ridge, clutching a rabbit's foot in his small hand. He placed it carefully on the moss and whispered something Josiah could not hear. Then he ran back toward the town, glancing behind him as though pursued. When Josiah approached the spot later, the charm was gone. The trees stood hushed, watchful, the mist at their feet curling like smoke. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, and retreated quickly, heart pounding. Back in his room, he scrawled his darkest thought yet. The valley's peace is not peace at all. It is a tax upon the soul. The sisters do not age because they do not live as we do. They consume not flesh nor coin, but the possible lives of those who dwell here. The valley is prosperous because the people are pruned. And as he wrote, a knock sounded at his door, soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. Josiah froze at the knock, the candlelight flickering as though it too had grown afraid. When he opened the door, no one stood on the threshold. Only a bundle of herbs bound with twine lay on the step, their scent sharp and unfamiliar. He knew instantly who had left them. Agnes. The midwife had not finished her tale. She was offering him another breadcrumb along the path, though whether it led to truth or to ruin, he could not yet tell. He carried the bundle to her cabin the following evening. The old woman sat by her fire, her eyes cloudy yet piercing as before. She motioned for him to sit, and before he could speak she rasped, "You've seen too much already. The hollow knows you. It will not let you leave unchanged. But perhaps you should know what the people fear most. They whisper of a room in that house, a place they call the loom room." Josiah leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Agnes's voice dropped to a hushed tremor. "They say it is a chamber with no windows, where the sisters gather in secret. Inside are no threads, no needles, no cloth. Yet the air hums, as if a great weaving is being done. Some claim they can hear it when the wind is still, the sound of lives being spun and measured, not fabric, not rope, but destinies." She paused to sip from a cracked cup, her gnarled hands shaking. "The hollow has long believed the sisters do not merely preserve our lives, they shape them. They decide who prospers and who falters, who loves and who mourns. They prune and they bind. They weave the patterns that keep the valley in its cage. To resist them is to have your thread cut short. To please them is to be woven into comfort. Either way, The pattern remains theirs. Josiah's mind reeled. It was one thing to suspect the sisters fed upon the people's futures, another to imagine they might hold the very fabric of those futures in their hands, weaving and unweaving them at will. He could not shake the thought of the faint hum he had heard outside their house, the vibration that had sunk into his bones. Could that have been the loom, echoing through the walls? Agnes met his eyes, her voice cracking like dry wood. Do not seek that room, surveyor. Some truths unravel the man who learns them. But Josiah already knew he would. His hand closed around the herb she had given him. A charm of protection, she hekishket, Ad said, though her gaze betrayed her doubt. Josiah left Agnes's cabin with the warning echoing in his ears, yet his resolve only hardened. The loom room, whether real or imagined, had taken root in his mind like a splinter that would not ease out. He could not stop thinking of it, the hidden chamber where destinies were measured, and threads unseen were pulled taut or severed. His rational mind told him such tales were the inventions of frightened people desperate to explain what they could not comprehend. But another voice, darker and more insistent, whispered that if such a place did exist, to glimpse it would mean glimpsing the very machinery of fate itself. For Josiah, that temptation was unbearable. He began to plan his entry. He could not storm the house, nor ask outright. The sisters would never grant him such permission. But he remembered what one of them had said the first day he approached the homestead. We are fond of nature's rarities. He clung to those words. If he could present them with something so unusual, so extraordinary, perhaps it would win him entry into the house itself. He began to scour the valley for specimens, pushing deeper into the groves, crawling along damp ravines, searching for any plant that defied the ordinary. His notes grew more feverish by the day. He described ferns whose fractal patterns seemed endless, blossoms that shifted shade depending on the angle of the sun, even a strange vine that bled a red sap when cut. He gathered sketches and pressed samples, his satchel filling with evidence of the valley's peculiar bounty. Yet all the while, his eyes drifted toward the ridge, toward the house that watched in silence. The longer he remained, the more he felt its presence weighing upon him, as though the sisters already knew his intentions and simply waited for him to step across the threshold of their design. At night, he rehearsed the words he would use, the guise of a naturalist eager to share his findings, to beg for permission to study their collection more closely. But beneath the careful phrasing, his heart beat with a singular desire. To see what lay within that sealed chamber, to uncover whether human lives were truly woven and cut like threads. His journal from this period is scattered with half-legible fragments, lines scrawled in haste. Truth behind walls, threads hum in silence. If they hold the pattern, they hold us all. By the end of the week, he was ready. He had chosen his rarest specimen, and he knew he would not leave the hollow until he had seen inside that house. The morning Josiah chose to approach the house again was draped in fog so heavy it seemed the valley itself tried to conceal what was about to unfold. He carried in his hands a carefully wrapped specimen, a blossom of pale ivory he had discovered deep in the ravine, its petals veined with threads of silver that shimmered faintly even in shadow. It was unlike anything he had catalogued before, unlike anything he believed the sisters could ignore. His heart pounded as he mounted the path to the ridge, every step a drumbeat of resolve and fear. The door opened before he could knock. Another Sister A appeared, her hair black as coal, her eyes pale as morning frost. She regarded him in silence, her expression unreadable, until his trembling hands revealed the blossom. "For your collection," he said softly, his voice catching. The silence stretched, long enough that he felt sure she would dismiss him back into the mist. But then her gaze lingered on the flower, and for the first time since his arrival in the hollow, he saw the faintest glimmer of intrigue. She stepped aside. "Enter." The air within the house was colder than the forest outside, filled with the faint smell of earth and smoke. The interior was immaculate yet barren, the wood polished, the furniture sparse. The silence pressed in on him, thick as stone. His eyes were drawn to the far end of the corridor, where a narrow door stood shut, its frame older than the rest of the house, its edges worn as if countless hands had brushed against it, but never opened it freely. His breath caught. He knew what it must be. The sister led him through rooms lined with shelves of jars, herbs, and preserved roots. She studied his specimen with clinical interest, her lips forming a faint smile that chilled him more than any scowl. Yet Josiah's gaze kept drifting back toward that narrow door. For a moment, when her attention turned away, he thought he heard it, a low vibration, like the thrumming of strings plucked in unison, the same sound he had once felt humming in his bones from outside the homestead. It seemed to seep through the very walls. His hands trembled. He dared to step closer, only a pace, until he could see the faint lines carved into the wood, not decoration, but the same geometry he had seen at the spring's edge, a circle with interwoven lines forming a star. His pulse thundered. He had found it. The loom room was real. And even before its door opened, Josiah knew that if he crossed its threshold, he might never leave the hollow unchanged. Josiah never saw the door open. Whether the sisters sensed his intent, or whether the house itself betrayed him, he could not tell. But what followed was not discovery. It was rupture. That evening, as he stumbled back toward the valley floor, a sound rolled across Larkspur Hollow, unlike anything he had ever heard. It was not thunder, though the sky was clear. It was not the crack of gunfire, though it split the air like a volley. It was a groaning, a tearing, as though the earth itself was straining against chains that had bound it for centuries. Birds exploded from the treetops in panicked flocks, and the livestock in the fields bellowed in terror. The very air quivered with pressure. When Josiah turned his eyes toward the ridge, he saw the mist above the grove convulse and lift, drawn upward in a column, as though pulled by unseen hands. The spring, black and still as he had last seen it, now shuddered with a pale light, a glow that pulsed violently against the darkness. The ground around it split in jagged seams, steam hissing from the ruptures. The lock had loosened. And with it, the sisters began to change. Josiah swore he saw them, standing in the garden below their home, their faces no longer masks of youth, but mirrors of rapid decay. Skin that had been luminous only hours before sagged and lined, hair dulled and streaked with grey, joints bent beneath sudden age. It was as if the years they had denied for so long had come rushing back in a torrent crest, hing over them in moments rather than decades. Yet they did not scream. Their voices rose instead in that same low hum Josiah had once heard in the night, a sound so deep and resonant it rattled his ribs. They were not resisting the unravelling. They were holding it back, stalling the collapse for one more breath, one more second, as though their song alone could bind the fissures tearing open in the land. Josiah fell to his knees, unable to breathe beneath the weight of the vibration. His maps, his notes, his carefully pressed samples, all seemed like childish toys before the sight of it, a machine of time and flesh unravelling. He realized with a horror too vast to contain that whatever bargain had been struck in this place was breaking, and the hollow itself was about to pay the price. The night the balance broke, the valley saw fire. From the ridge, Josiah watched the Harrow homestead glow with a pale light that quickly swelled into furious flame. The timbers, untouched by time for more than a century, burned as though soaked in oil, each beam collapsing inward with the shriek of splitting wood. Sparks rained down into the mist-choked grove, and the earth itself seemed to recoil, heaving as though rejecting what it could no longer contain. The villagers poured into the square below, their faces pale, their voices raised in terrified confusion. Some cried the sisters' names, others prayed aloud, but none dared to climb the ridge. They stood frozen, as though rooted to the ground, compelled to watch the undoing of their own covenant. The flames roared higher, licking at the sky, and with each crash of collapsing timber, the air carried a sound almost human, a sigh that rose and fell like a death knell. By dawn, nothing remained but a blackened ruin. Smoke coiled upward in bitter spirals, and ash drifted through the valley like grey snow. Josiah, driven by both dread and duty, climbed the ridge at first light. The clearing stank of burnt resin, and something sharper, something metallic. The house had been reduced to charred ribs of timber, still smouldering in places. He picked his way through the wreckage, his boots crunching over brittle fragments. But what he found in the ashes chilled him more than the fire itself. Near the heart of the ruin lay 4 small objects, untouched by flame. Dolls, each carved of porcelain, their faces painted with delicate precision, their eyes fixed in glassy stares. Their clothing, though singed, bore uncanny resemblance to the sisters' own garments. The resemblance was unmistakable. 4 sisters, 4 dolls, lying intact amid the wreckage. There were no bodies, no bones, no remains of flesh or ash to suggest the sisters had perished in the fire. Only the dolls, staring upward with faint, unbroken smiles, as though mocking the futility of seeking proof. Josiah lifted one with trembling hands, its porcelain surface cool against his skin, despite the smouldering embers all around. Its weight was wrong, too heavy for its size, as though filled with something denser than clay. He replaced it quickly, unsettled. The villagers who dared to climb after him found only what he had seen, a ruin and 4 dolls. They left in silence, carrying no explanation, only fear. For the hollow had been stripped of its keepers, and no one knew what the valley would become without them. The days after the fire brought no relief, only decay. Without the sisters, the valley began to wither, as if an unseen hand had withdrawn its favor. Fields that had stood tall and golden only a week before began to yellow, their stalks collapsing into brittle husks. Cows grew thin despite full troughs, and chickens that had once laid without fail ceased altogether, their coops silent. The hollow's children, once rosy-cheeked and strong, fell into fevers, their eyes glassy, their cries weak. Mothers who had once given birth with uncanny ease now labored in agony, some never rising again from their beds. The people tried to tell themselves it was chance, that the fire had been tragedy enough, that these new hardships were the natural cruelties of the world returning after a long absence. But fear crept through the valley like a sickness. They had grown used to a life without struggle, and now every blight, every cough, every failure of the soil seemed to echo the absence of the sisters. They had been prison wardens, yes, but their prison had been secure, predictable, safe. Without them, the hollow stood exposed, and the people were ill-prepared for freedom. Josiah recorded what he saw in frantic detail, his handwriting jagged with exhaustion. The balance is broken. The hollow unravels. For decades these people gave tribute to the Harrows and lived in complacent comfort. Now they are thrown naked into the world, and the world shows them no mercy. I fear they will curse me for witnessing this, as though my very presence loosened the knot that held them together. At night he heard weeping in the cabins, voices raised in argument, prayers muttered aloud in tones of desperation. A farmer, whose fields had blackened within days, accused his neighbor of withholding tribute before the fire. Fistfights broke out in the square. What had once been a quiet, watchful community was now fracturing under the weight of uncertainty. And yet no one spoke of rebuilding the Harrow homestead. No one dared to return tribute to the charred ridge. The people knew deep in their bones that the pact had ended, not by neglect but by violence, and the sisters would not return. They were gone. Or worse, they were watching still, their silence heavier than their presence had ever been. In the months that followed, the Harrow sisters passed from reality into legend, though the line between the two was thinner than anyone wished to admit. The valley, stripped of its pact, sank into hardship. Families whispered of leaving, of seeking new land where the earth was not cursed, but few dared to venture far. And in that silence, the stories began. Children swore they heard voices at dusk, low and melodic, rising from the ridge where the house had stood. Farmers claimed they saw 4 shapes moving between the trees, pale figures gliding just beyond the edge of sight. Some insisted the sisters had not perished in the fire at all, but had shed their human skins, leaving behind only those dolls as decoys. One evening, Josiah overheard a group of boys daring one another to climb the ridge at twilight. They returned pale and trembling, unable to speak of what they had seen. Only one word slipped from their lips before they fled home to their mothers, watching. The tale spread quickly, and soon no child in the hollow would pass the northern ridge without muttering a prayer under their breath. Hunters who ventured into the deeper woods returned shaken, describing strange phenomena they could not explain. A clearing where sound seemed to vanish altogether, a patch of moss that glowed faintly as if lit from beneath, a hollow tree that hummed when touched, its vibrations sinking into the bones. Always, at the edges of these stories, lingered the same description. 4 women, ageless and silent, their eyes fixed on the intruder until he fled. The dolls, too, took on a place in the folklore. Some said they had been buried in consecrated ground by the townsfolk. Others claimed they had been hidden away in locked chests, too dangerous to leave in the open. But there were whispers that at night they could still be heard, porcelain mouths clicking faintly in the dark, a sound like teeth grinding. The people told themselves these were only stories, born of fear, yet they kept their distance. No one touched the dolls again. Josiah noted grimly, "The hollow has traded one prison for another. Once they were bound by silence, now they are bound by memory. The sisters live on not in flesh, but in fear, and in many ways that is the stronger chain." As the years crept on, the hollow began to empty. Families who had once clung to the valley with stubborn devotion packed their belongings and fled, unable to endure the withering soil and the constant unease. Cabins were left to sag and rot, fences collapsed into the earth, and once ordered fields grew wild with briars. Those who remained lived in suspicion of one another, bound together less by community than by shared fear. The valley had lost its unnatural prosperity, and with it, its people. Outsiders arrived eventually, men with coin and ambition, who saw only abandoned land waiting to be claimed. They purchased tracts of soil for a pittance, deaf to the warnings of those few who still lingered. They set their cattle to graze, their ploughs to work, and for a season it seemed the hollow might awaken again. But the land resisted. Livestock sickened, crops withered, accidents multiplied. Hired hands left in the night, muttering of whispers in the trees and shapes gliding through the fog. The newcomers dismissed it at first as superstition, yet they too began to avoid the northern ridge, unwilling to look too long at the charred clearing where the Harrow house had once stood. Rumours persisted that the spring beneath the grove had not been destroyed, only wounded. Travellers spoke of strange vapours rising from the ground on cold mornings, of a faint humming that drifted across the valley when the wind died. Some swore they saw a glow beneath the soil, as though the earth itself still pulsed with light, a heart beating faintly beneath its scars. Josiah, now hollow-eyed and weary, recorded it all. He wrote that the valley itself seemed alive, still bound to the sisters, though their bodies were gone. "The pact," he scrawled, "was not ended by fire. It was broken, but not undone. Something waits beneath that soil. The lock is damaged, but the key may yet be turned again." His notes grew erratic, filled with sketches of circles and stars, lines drawn over and over until the page tore. When strangers asked why the hollow lay abandoned, the few remaining settlers would shake their heads and say only that the land had been cursed by a bargain too old to remember. Yet their voices carried the tremor of those who remembered all too well. And still, on certain nights, a watcher lingering near the ridge could swear the mist gathered in 4 distinct shapes, silent, patient, waiting. Time dulled the valley's scars, but the story of the Harrow Sisters did not vanish. It travelled outward, carried in fragments by those who had once lived under their gaze. Families who fled Larkspur Hollow settled in towns and villages beyond the mountains, bringing with them hushed warnings and half-remembered details. Around hearthfires they told their children not to stray too far from home at dusk, for that was when the watchers might appear. In faded journals, in sermons laced with caution, in lullabies sung low to restless infants, the legend survived. The sisters' names were seldom spoken, but their presence lingered in suggestion. Farmers muttered of them when storms struck without warning. Mothers invoked them when children dreamed too vividly. Even when softened into folklore, their story retained the taste of fear, like iron on the tongue. Over time, the tale changed shape. Some said the sisters had been witches burned in their own house. Others swore they were angels cast down for pride. A few insisted they were neither, but something older, woven from the valley itself, wearing human form as a disguise. Josiah's own writings, smuggled from the hollow in bundles of tattered pages, surfaced decades later in obscure collections. Scholars dismissed them as fevered delusion, a lonely surveyor driven mad by isolation. Yet in the margins, his words carried the ring of lived terror. The sisters are not gone. Their silence is a mask. The lock may break, but what it binds does not die. It waits. Those who read the lines aloud often shivered, though they could not say why. Among the descendants of Hollow families, the tale became darker still. They told of a curse that clung to their bloodlines, dreams of 4 women standing at the foot of the bed, porcelain-skinned and ageless, their eyes reflecting candlelight like glass. Some claimed children were born with strange gifts, uncanny intuition or knowledge they could not have learned. These children often grew sickly, fading before their time, as though a debt still pressed upon the families of the Hollow. Yet with each generation, the story softened, blurred by distance. By the turn of the century, the Harrow Sisters lived more as a cautionary ghost story than a warning of real danger. Still, the ridge remained untouched. Travellers who wandered near often reported an inexplicable sense of being observed, of stepping into a space that remembered them, though they had never been there before. Folklore had become history, and history had become myth, but the myth still carried teeth. As the decades turned, the tale of the Harrow Sisters became more than memory. It became metaphor. Preachers used it as a parable in their sermons, warning their congregations of bargains too costly, of comforts that enslave. Teachers repeated it to restless children as a cautionary tale. Obey, or the sisters will take your future. But beneath the moralizing, a darker truth hummed. The Hollow had not simply been cursed by 4 ageless women. It had been shaped by a system of control so complete that even after its collapse, the people who lived there could not imagine life without it. They mourned the prison bars because the bars had made them feel safe. Josiah had written of this shift with a clarity that unsettles even now. In one of his final entries he scrawled, "The Hollow is not a place, it is a pattern. Wherever people exchange their freedom for the promise of ease, the sisters will return, not in form, but in function. They need not walk among us. The system itself becomes their voice." His words, dismissed by scholars as madness, read now like prophecy. For what was Larkspur Hollow, if not a mirror of the bargains humans make again and again? The people received health, prosperity, certainty. In return, they surrendered their choices, their ambitions, their ability to change. It was not chains or violence that bound them, but the slow erosion of possibility. They were pruned, as Agnes had whispered, until only the safe branches remained. And though the sisters were gone, the memory of that pruning remained sharp enough to slice through generations. Even as folklore softened their names into myth, the lesson persisted. Beware the quiet bargains, the easy paths, the silent agreements that seem harmless but cost everything unseen. The Harrow Sisters may have been reduced to ghost stories, but their pattern lived on in every household where fear outweighed freedom, in every community where silence was traded for stability. The ridge grew over with weeds, the ruins sank beneath moss and ash, but those who wandered too close still swore they heard the faint vibration in the air, like strings drawn tight across the earth. It was not only memory, it was a warning, echoing through soil and stone. A reminder that the price of security is always higher than it first appears, and that the pattern of the hollow could awaken wherever people chose stasis over struggle. The more the legend spread, the more its shape shifted into something disturbingly familiar. Listeners began to recognize the sisters not as figures bound to a single valley, but as shadows of forces that still moved among them. Josiah's final words lingered like a curse. The hollow is a pattern. And in that pattern, people began to see reflections of their own age. The sisters, 4 in number, came to symbolize more than ageless women hidden in a forest. They became the names we give to the invisible bargains we make every day. One was convenience, the promise that life could be made easier if we surrendered choice. Why toil when the path of least resistance waits? The villagers of Larkspur never worried for their crops or their health, because the sisters had stripped away the possibility of failure, and in that stripping, they also stripped away growth. Another was certainty, the desire to know that tomorrow will mirror today, that no surprise will unseat the order of things. The hollow's prosperity was unnatural not because it was abundant, but because it never faltered. Certainty is comfort, but it is also stagnation, a field that never risks the storm and therefore never grows strong roots. The third was belonging, the unity forged by silence, the way an entire community agreed to guard a secret too heavy for any one person to carry. Their hush was their bond. To question was to betray not only the sisters, but the whole. And so, the townsfolk taught their children not with answers, but with fear. The last was reward, the visible proof that tribute brought blessings, a healed animal, a safe birth, a harvest without blight. Each gift was real, each benefit tangible, but always with an invisible cost paid in futures that never came to pass. Convenience, certainty, belonging, reward. 4 faces of the same pattern. 4 sisters of the modern age, alive not in the woods of Tennessee, but in the systems we now inhabit, subtle and pervasive. We may not leave baskets of fruit at a ridge, but we surrender small freedoms each day for the promise of comfort, for the illusion of safety, for the fleeting relief of being cared for. The hollow did not vanish with the fire. It was only waiting to be named again in language suited to a new century. And when you look closely, you may realize that the sisters never left us at all. The danger of such systems is not only in their existence, but in their breaking. Larkspur Hollow proved this with terrible clarity. For generations, the people lived in quiet submission, their lives pruned and ordered, until the sisters were torn away in fire and ruin. What followed was not liberation, but collapse. Crops failed, fevers spread, violence flared between neighbors who no longer knew how to live without invisible hands guiding them. The hollow had forgotten the art of struggle, and when freedom was thrust back upon them, it felt less like a gift than a curse. Josiah's journals captured the paradox in words that shiver on the page. They wanted freedom, but when it came, they found themselves naked before the storm. They had traded resilience for comfort, and when comfort vanished, they had nothing left. His observation is more than history. It is warning. For when a system offers stability in exchange for choice, the longer one remains within it, the harder it is to survive outside of it. Even in modern times, we feel the echo of that collapse. Remove the conveniences we rely upon, the smooth flow of information, the instant access to food, medicine, warmth, and see how quickly chaos rises. Like the Hollow, we have been softened by ease. To step outside the pattern is to stumble into uncertainty, and uncertainty is terrifying. So we cling to the system, even when we sense it tightening around us, because the alternative is struggle. The villagers cursed their fate when the pact ended, yet few admitted they had been complicit in sustaining it. They blamed the fire, the strangers, even Josiah himself, but not the bargain they had struck. In this too, we mirror them. We rage against the collapse of comforts, but seldom question the price we paid to have them in the first place. Freedom is not peace. It is peril and hardship, risk and loss. And that truth unsettles more deeply than the sisters ever did, for their faces, however strange, could be avoided. Their pact, however terrible, could be obeyed. But the storm of uncertainty cannot be escaped. The Hollow teaches us that to break free from a perfect prison is to enter a wilderness raw and untamed, and in that wilderness most would rather run back to the bars than face the cost of being free. The Harrow Sisters of Larkspur Hollow may have vanished into ash and folklore, but their pattern remains. The faces are gone, the porcelain dolls long buried or forgotten, yet the barg, they embodied, persists in quieter, subtler forms. We live now in a world where the prison is not a valley but a network, where the tribute is not baskets of fruit but pieces of our attention, our data, our choices surrendered without thought. The hum that once rose from the ridge can be heard today in the endless vibration of machines, in the servers that never sleep, in the currents of systems that promise us ease and certainty, while quietly narrowing the paths we're allowed to walk. The Hollow was never just a place. It was a lesson. It showed what happens when people accept comfort in exchange for freedom, when they silence their questions in return for security. And though the sisters are remembered as eerie figures drifting through fog, perhaps the greater terror is that they no longer need to appear at all. Their work continues without them, etched into the bargains we strike every day. Josiah's last surviving note, smudged and nearly unreadable, contained only a single line. The pattern repeats. Whether he meant the Hollow, the sisters, or the world itself, no one can say. But it lingers like a warning. Because perhaps the most frightening truth is not that the sisters still watch from the tree line, but that we have already welcomed them back in other guises, polished, modern, invisible. They do not need to be seen if we are willing to play our part, offering up our futures thread by thread, until the tapestry is no longer ours. So when you think of the Harrow Sisters, do not imagine only the past. Imagine the present. Ask yourself, what comforts do you cling to, and what price are you paying for them? What part of your future is being pruned quietly, so you may live in certainty today? That is the real haunting. Not 4 women in the woods, but the recognition that their pact is alive, stitched into our lives, still humming, still waiting. And if this story unsettled you, if it made you wonder what patterns surround your own life, then stay with us. Subscribe to the Macabre record, where we bring forward the tales you were never meant to hear, the histories buried not in earth, but in silence. Because sometimes the darkest folklore is not a story of the past. It is a blueprint of the future.